Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur and we are running in the 6th week of the course. Today is the last lecture of the week, and in this lecture we will be talking about dyslexia. Now dyslexia, as you might know, is a difficulty in reading irrespective of, say for example, other cognitive attributes being alright. Individuals might face difficulty in reading. So say for example, if the IQ is alright, if other developmental aspects are completely working fine, intellectually and other motor and other cognitive function are working fine, and still the person is sort of finding it difficult to read, that is usually where dyslexia kind of can be diagnosed. And we'll kind of talk about certain aspects of dyslexia, not really the disorder in so much detail, but we'll probably talk a little bit about how the specific deficits in dyslexia can be handled by various of the models of word recognition that we've talked about. So let us not waste a lot of time and start with this. Now dyslexia basically occurs when an individual has a problem with reading, even though they are otherwise intellectually and behaviorally normal and have had proper instruction and opportunity to practice reading. So the last part is also very important. Sometimes people would have difficulty in reading because they've not got the best of the instruction, because they've not practiced hard enough, because they've not been exposed to correct practices of reading. However, dyslexia can only be diagnosed if both the the behavioral and the intellectual parts are normal, and also after enough practice, after enough exposure to reading, the individual is still finding it difficult to learn to read. Approximately, say for example, as far as the Western data is concerned, approximately about 15% of males and around 5% of females will have what is called developmental dyslexia. Basically, they are not able to learn to read. Okay. There are also, say for example, common threads between developmental dyslexia and acquired dyslexia. Acquired dyslexia could be, say for example, the ability to ability of learning to read is lost on the way. But say for example, in developmental dyslexia, it is that the individual could not acquire the skill of reading anyways. Now the commonalities that we are talking about basically could be, say for example, in both developmental and acquired dyslexia, there are people who have trouble reading non-words such as fiend and then exception words, words that look like but sound different than other words such as have. We compared have and save. So non-words basically so people in both developmental dyslexia and acquired dyslexia might have trouble in reading non-words. Okay. Basically telling us that the assembled phonology route might not really be working fine. We'll talk about that in more detail. Now in both cases, and there are groups of both developmental and acquired dyslexics who have sometimes less trouble reading non-words than reading exception words. So sort of a dissociation can be seen. In some patients find it more difficult to read non-words but find it easier to read exception words, whereas some patients will find it easier to read exception words but have more difficulty to read non-words, or maybe I just mix it. So exception words, non-words, some people are good at exception, poor at non-words, some people are poor at exception, good at non-words, so something like that. Now when an individual has greater trouble reading non-words than exception words, they are classified as phonological or deep dyslexics. Basically because their assembled phonological route is not really working fine, they are not being able to create grapheme to phoneme conversions and then concatenate basically sound level representations of each of the letters to create the sound level representation of the entire word. When a person has less trouble reading non-words, saying that their phonological route are working fine, but they have difficulty reading exception words like pint and have and TO2 and go etc., then basically they are referred to as surface dyslexics. Basically the direct route is probably at problem here, because while they can still do the phonological grapheme to phoneme conversion, they cannot really come up with the direct pronunciations of these words. Now in this sense, it is important to recognize that most dyslexics fall into mixed category. Most dyslexic will have some problems with exception words and some problems with non-words. It's not really a very neatly categorizable deficiency, that somebody would only and only have problems with non-words and somebody else would have only and only problems with exception words. Okay, so pure cases, that's why as I was saying, pure cases of either phonological dyslexia or surface dyslexia are more like exceptions rather than being the norm. Now, one of the continuing controversies in dyslexia research is whether different kinds of dyslexia actually reflect the deficiency in different kinds of underlying deficits or underlying processes, or whether dyslexia is caused by a single underlying problem which affects both the processing of non-words and processing of exception words. Now, one of these kind of perspectives that have sought to understand dyslexia basically argues that a single deficit in phonological representations gives rise to problems with both the phonological dyslexics and surface dyslexics. This was put forward by Stanovich and colleagues, and Stanovich and colleagues basically start by rejecting a common classification scheme for dyslexia. They basically say they reject the requirement that dyslexia diagnosis can be reserved for children with normal IQ accompanied by reading problems. They say for example, it cannot be seen like that. They note that this definition implicitly assumes that reading problems of people with higher intelligence have a different locus or have a different source as compared to the reading problems of people with lower intelligence. They say intelligence has nothing to do with it and should not really factor in the definition of dyslexia as such. Okay, because there is no direct evidence that they found that supports this assumption, and they kind of reject this distinction altogether. Dyslexia is just problem with reading irrespective of whether you have a higher normal IQ or a lower IQ. Now, what they do is that instead of investigating a single subset of people with reading problems, Stanovich and colleagues try to identify as many people as possible who share the characteristic of having difficulty reading. So, for example, you will not really only go to normally intellectually functioning people and see their reading problems. You will go to everybody and you will see what kind of reading problems exist in the population, and then you will try to understand that. Instead of presupposing that different people have different underlying problems that lead to reading difficulties, they basically, Stanovich and colleagues, apply sophisticated statistical techniques to find those individual characteristics that best predict the reading problems that people might face. In other words, what they are trying to do is they are trying to let their data do the talking. They are trying to let their data point towards the underlying causes, and then they can use this data to basically classify people into dyslexic poor reader, non-dyslexic poor reader kind of groups. Okay. Now, when poor readers in this kind of a classification are treated as a single group, what happens is that in Stanovich and colleagues find variables that predict performance in traditionally defined dyslexics, and also predict, and the same variables have found to predict performance in other poor readers who are traditionally not classified as dyslexics. Now, also say for example, you can kind of in this sort of method find other cognitive variables that could be correlated with reading, and Stanovich and colleagues basically concluded that is why there could be just a single problem dealing with the specification of the phonological information which kind of accounts for people's variability in reading performance. If you remember, in the last lecture I was talking to you about phonological awareness, and I said that phonological awareness could be a basic predictor of how well a person is going to be able to read eventually. It is very similar to what the Stanovich and colleagues have found, and they say that basically a single problem dealing with phonological information, say for example how well you understand that a large sound can be composed of so many different sounds, and you can kind of delete sounds or add sounds or blend sounds together. That kind of knowledge could be able to explain people's reading difficulties irrespective of the fact that they are high IQ or low IQ, irrespective of the fact that whether they are classified as actual dyslexics or not as dyslexics but poor readers. As a result, basically they call this as the phonological core variable difference model. So they say the basic difference is between the phonological core. According to this kind of model, some dyslexic individuals have degraded phonological representations as compared to others, and that is why they have more severe problems representing the and processing the phonological information, and then these individuals are classified as phonological dyslexics. The reading patterns of the phonological dyslexics and the kinds of errors they make basically differs a lot from younger readers who are matched, who are generally matched on overall other kinds of skills, general reading skills for example. Other dyslexic individuals which have slightly mildly degraded phonological representations, their reading patterns and the kinds of errors they make would basically closely match the pattern displayed by younger readers who have the same overall reading skill. Okay. As a result, sometimes the researchers basically call this group as delayed type dyslexics rather than surface dyslexics to highlight their similarity to younger normally developing readers. Now, basically the reading difficulty is exhibited by surface dyslexics according to this kind of approach. The phonological covariance variable model are partly the result of different difficulty in mapping letters to phonemes. So, this is the basic problem that is happening with these individuals, and partly the result of insufficient exposure and training and practice. So, these people basically have not really got sufficient information, sufficient opportunity to train, sufficient opportunity to practice how these skills need to be learned. Now, the idea basically here is that these delayed type dyslexics can catch up to their normally reading peers with more intensive training, with say for example training of on tasks of phonological awareness and so on so forth. Now, one of the problems however with this phonological core variable difference model is that some dyslexic readers appear to have normal phonological codes, whereas other dyslexic readers have degraded, severely or mildly degraded phonological codes. Now, if you kind of look at it and if you say that if an individual has degraded phonological codes, they should have at least some problems processing speech. Okay, they should have some problems in understanding or listening, perceiving speech as well. But recent research kind of identifies that some subtle speech processing deficits in groups of phonological dyslexics happen. About half of the phonological dyslexics were tested for performance, basically tested who were tested performed about the same as the normal control group in various phoneme discrimination tasks. So, this is sort of a problem with the phonological core difference model, which basically says that contrary to the hypothesis of a single underlying phonological deficit, there appears to be a significant number of phonological dyslexics who have high fidelity phonological representations. So, therefore, this idea of a single variable, single phonological core variable that kind of defines everybody's reading problems might not really be very correct after all, even though it kind of does a decent job of offering diagnostics and training. Now, other kinds of single deficit accounts basically of dyslexia focus on the fact that dyslexic readers often also have problems with other cognitive tasks such as sequencing, motor control and spatial information processing. So, basically the idea is that they kind of have data which shows that there are other problems happening as well. So, what is the deficit that could be common to all of these problems, reading problems, spatial problems, motor problems, sequencing problems that these dyslexic patients are kind of facing. Now, in light of these kinds of findings, some researchers have looked for a slightly more basic, slightly more deeper neurological problem that could simultaneously give rise to dyslexia and also the other kind of cognitive deficits. One of these theories, basically one of the possible unified deficit theory of dyslexia, therefore involves the anatomy and the physiology of the neural systems involved in visual word processing. So, the eyes and those kind of systems. A similar theory is the Magnocellular Theory of dyslexia. The Magnocellular Theory of dyslexia basically argues that there is one deficit in the specific part of the visual system, basically the lateral geniculate nucleus. Now, if you remember the organization of the visual system, I have talked about it in a different course, basic cognitive process, which is also going on. You can kind of go and look at that chapter. But if you look at how the visual system is organized, basically you have the eyes, and the eyes kind of from the eyes there is the system of optical nerves, and the optical nerves kind of go and they kind of cross somewhere which is called the optical chiasm and then go into the cortex. Somewhere before it kind of reaches there, it kind of passes through this set of cells called the lateral geniculate nuclei, and this lateral geniculate nucleus is basically there at the thalamus. It's kind of a part of the brain that relays the signals from the retina to the visual cortex, and it has two kinds of neurons arranged in these layers. There are parvocellular layers and the magnocellular neurons. The parvocellular layers are basically made up of physically small neurons that respond well to differences in colors, and the magnocellular layers are composed of physically slightly larger neurons that respond well to movement and also are responsible for dealing with high temporal frequency information. You have to quickly read, the information changing in time. Visual patterns that change substantially in a relative amount of time. That is the job of these magnocellular layers. Now, why should it be, and you might ask, why should it be that the magnocellular layer or the deficits in the magnocellular layer lead to problems with reading? There are two answers. First is that the magnocellular layer of the lateral geniculate nucleus are connected to populations of neurons in the parietal lobe that make an important contribution to reading. That is one, as evidenced by the fact that damage to these parietal areas can also lead to significant impairments in reading ability. And small disturbances in these lateral geniculate nuclei function can be magnified downstream towards the cortical, because this is the relay area. So, if the information is not really handled very well here, it will not really go in a very veridical fashion to the in a very correct fashion to the higher cortical area. So, it will kind of magnify the problem if the system is slightly problematic here. Second is the magnocellular visual processing layers basically also contributes to eye movement control and reading efficiency, and this basically it's known, and we've been talking I think in the first and the second lectures that reading efficiently requires you to have very good control on your eye movement. It requires you to have very stable, accurately targeted fixations. So, there are these two reasons where you can kind of think that the magnocellular layers might be involved here, and that is why the magnocellular deficit in the magnocellular layer might lead to problems here. Now, the magnocellular hypothesis basically can explain some patterns of symptoms in some dyslexic readers, but it does not really cover the entire spectrum of dyslexic reading problems, and therefore the approach continues to generate new research and new controversies. While some studies, say for example, Galaburda in 1985 and Eden and colleagues in 1996 found evidence that the physical development or functioning of the magnocellular visual system differs from the normal in dyslexic readers, other studies have really failed to find a straightforward connection between deficits in the magnocellular layer and people's reading problems. For example, Anne Sperling and colleagues in 2003 found that dyslexic readers with greatest difficulty in phonological processing tasks who are thought to which are thought to underlie their reading problems actually had the best magnocellular function within the dyslexic groups. So, that kind of does not really follow very well. Now, this was some of the single root theories, single deficit theories of dyslexia. Let us move on to how dyslexia can be explained by the single root models of word reading versus dual root models of word reading. Now, also considerable research has gone into testing whether these models, the dual root cascaded model or the single root models, can reproduce behaviors that dyslexic readers exhibit. So, for example, if these models reproduce similar patterns of deficits as actual dyslexic readers, you can kind of figure out what pattern of difficulties led to this kind of performance, and it might be a good clue to check as to what really has happened with the dyslexic readers in the first place. Now, according to the dual root theory of visual word processing, there are two ways to access a word's pronunciation, as we said, the assembled phonological route and the direct orthographic route. Now, the dual root model therefore suggests that there are two different underlying deficits that could give rise to phonological dyslexia and surface dyslexia. Let us look at that in a bit more detail. Now, damage to the assembled phonological route would lead to phonological dyslexia, and the individuals will lose the ability to sound out the words that they have not seen before. I was saying this earlier as well, I believe. Damage to the direct route basically would lead to surface dyslexia, as individuals will find it difficult to come up directly with the pronunciations of the exception words like bouquet, psychology, and so on. Now, the single root models of reading view word reading as resulting from the difficulty resulting from the operation of a unified neural network. So, you say there is a single neural network, and this is basically what will be damaged in order to lead to the different kinds of impairment in dyslexia. Phonological dyslexia in these kind of models can be seen as resulting from damage to units that represent the phonological information, that is the phonological units. Surface dyslexia can result from changes to other aspects of the model, such as the number of processing units available to the system, basically going from phonology to meaning and phonology to orthography and so on. So, while single root models view non-word and exception word reading as being governed by the same sets of representational units and running the same processes, different kinds of dyslexia could reflect different underlying deficits. So, as different kinds of damage to the system can produce different kinds of behavior. So, what is really happening here is in the single root models, because they view non-word and exception word reading as being governed by the same sets of representational units running the same kind of processes, different kinds of dyslexia basically can come up if there are different patterns of damage to these same units. We will look at that in a bit more detail here. See, for example, this is a particular graph from Bailey's study, and you will see the predictions of what kind of deficits are there. There is reading level match control, so reading on exception words and non-words. There is surface dyslexics and phonological dyslexics. You can see the surface dyslexics are still alright, and the difference between exception word reading and non-word reading is a little bit, but in the phonological dyslexics you see that they are highly deficient in reading the non-words. Okay. Now, if you kind of look at that figure, the DRC, it shows data on non-word and exception word reading for surface dyslexics, phonological dyslexics, as well as age matched, reading ability matched controlled subjects. What do you find there? If you look at the data, the DRC model will straightforwardly explain these difference in different forms of dyslexia by proposing that different components or roots of the dual root models have been broken down. The surface dyslexia in that sense will reflect a problem using the direct root to access word meanings coupled with an intact assembled phonology root. The intact assembled phonology root basically enables the surface dyslexics to pronounce the non-words completely fine, but they obviously will lead to regularization errors with respect to exception words. According to the dual root model, deep dyslexia or phonological dyslexia shall be caused by a problem in the assembled phonology root coupled with an intact direct root. So, that is why these people will be able to read the exception words completely fine, but obviously they will not be able to read the normal words from the assembled phonology root. So, novel word reading will also be suffering here. Now, if the deep dyslexic has not seen the word before, the assembled phonology root is not able to compile a pronunciation, and the resulting pronunciation is actually going to be unrelated to the correct pronunciation. It will lead to a pattern of errors like the regularization errors. Now, when the DRC model was used to simulate dyslexic symptoms, different lesions in the direct root and the assembled phonology root were found necessary to capture the pattern of performance that is shown by the dyslexic individuals. If you talk about the single root models have also been tweaked in order to capture aspects of dyslexia. So, what happened was that in the original Seidenberg and McClellan model, it could also simulate some aspects of poor word reading. So, when half of the model basically when half of the hidden units in the model were removed, so the processing power is kind of reduced, its error scores for high frequency words were at about the same level, but the error scores for the low frequency words was basically the error scores for high and low frequency words were sort of in the same range. Now, however, this reduction in the number of hidden units had a greater effect for irregular words than regular words, which suggests that a greater number of hidden units is necessary for the processing of irregular words as compared to the processing of regular words. Now, a subsequent model later than the Seidenberg and McClellan model adopted a slightly more complex system of representing phonology, and it was trained on phonology before it was trained to recognize words. So, a different kind of model we are talking about. When the phonological representations in this model, this is a different model, were degraded in different ways, different patterns of deficit emerged. When mild damage was basically made to the network by imposing the limit, by imposing or limiting the degree to which representation, it kind of limited the degree to which different phonemes could be differed from one another. When moderate damage was simulated by eliminating one subcomponent of the phonological system and reducing the number of connections by half in the remaining units on top of the mild form of damage. In the mild damage condition, in this condition, the model really had no trouble with dealing with exception words, but it kind of broke down with respect to normal words, and it started having problems with non-words readings. When severe damage was simulated by adding random noise to the pattern of activity within the phonological unit, severe damage to the network, it kind of produced deficits in both exception word reading and non-word reading, which is sort of the pattern that is observed in surface dyslexia. So you see that this model kind of presents to us that there might be different degrees of damage in the phonological processing system that could lead to different kinds of performance by these readers. Mild damage could lead to problem with reading non-words, but not so much in exception words, but severe damage can lead to problems with reading both non-words and exception words at the same time. These simulations sort of provided an existence for proof of single root kind of architecture, that it is the same deficit which kind of in different degrees leads to different degrees of deficits in reading performance. So different patterns of reading word reading deficits that are observed in different kinds of dyslexia can therefore be produced by a computational mechanism that has a single set of connections between the input units and the pronunciation units, and that is where again it's very similar to the phonological code difference explanation. That is what is kind of playing a part. That was all from me about reading. We've sort of gotten a little bit of a clue about how dyslexia really happens and what are the theoretical underpinnings of different kinds of dyslexia. Thank you.